Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are continuing our reread of The Dark Knight Rises with a Selena chapter. So I guess let's jump right in. The little dive bar sat in the gray zone of Gotham City, an area of supposedly questionable repute between the Narrows and the darker side of Midtown. The place was close enough to the Narrows that it could have been cheap to buy and no one would bother to look into it unless asked, but not so close that it would turn too many people away. Selena sauntered up the stairs into the bar, her quote-unquote date on her arm. She remembered that it used to be the Roman's place, and honestly, she would rather him than the man she was going to meet tonight. Okay, so we get a little bit of establishment here. One problem, though, doesn't make any sense. Now, unless the implication here is that the gray zone doesn't actually cover the entirety of the middle section of Gotham, which I guess it could, this is kind of a problem with The Dark Knight Rises, particularly the unedited versions. I just kind of said, like, oh, the Narrows was everything south of a certain point, but that doesn't make any sense. A city like Gotham would be like any other big city, and it would have different specific neighborhoods and stuff like that. So the Narrows, as said in Batman Begins, would only be one part of the wider part of Gotham City. And yeah, I did still split Gotham City into like having the ritzier parts on the northern part of the island while the southern part was lower income. But the Narrows is still just one part of that. It would be like declaring everything the Hurricane District too. Like that wouldn't make any sense. So, yeah, and this half of the story was written that way, so I'm not entirely sure, like, did I just miss this stuff, or is the gray zone smaller than I thought it was? I don't know. It's also funny that the Narrows is that close to the middle class part of Gotham City, but anyway. When she passed through the door, she sat her date on one of the bar stools. He was too drunk to resist or probably care, she thought. She eyed the shady guys that stood around the door as she moved to... What? She eyed the shady guys that stood around the door as she moved into one of the tables in the middle of the room. I don't know why that "in" is there. It's not necessary. You bought a date? Stryver asked her. He had on a fancy suit and his dark hair was neatly combed. He'd stick out for miles around these parts. He looked like a prick, she thought. A porcelain-skinned prick. I like having someone around to open doors for me, she answered with a sly smile. She sat down across from him and pulled out an envelope from her purse. Right hand, no partials. He took it and slid the transparency out. 4 perfect fingerprints stared back at him, just like she said. Very nice, he said, and slipped it into his suit jacket. Not so fast, handsome. You got something for me? He smirked. Oh, yes. He signaled to a guy by the door who slid the locks. Another came up behind her chair. She smiled. I don't know what you're going to do with Mr. Wayne's prints, but I'm guessing you'll need his thumb. Stryver looked into the envelope again. You don't count so good, do you? I count fine. She felt a gun pressed to her temple. In fact, I'm counting to 10 right now. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes and reach for her purse. Okay. One of the guys took it from her and opened it himself. He pulled out her cell phone and slid it across the table. My friend is outside. Just hit send. Stryver picked up the phone and pushed the button. Selena avoided looking at him in the momentary silence. The guy at the door pulled the lock again when there was a knock. Jen walked in, hands in the pockets of her pants and her frizzy blonde hair looking a bit wild. Place is a little dead, she said when she reached the table. She pulled the envelope from her tank top and handed it to Selena. It'll liven up in a minute, Selena said, her voice tight. Trust me. Stryver took the envelope from her. Everything okay? Great, catch you later. Jen looked Stryver up and down before she walked back to the door. Selena turned to him now. It would have been a lot easier to just give me what we agreed on. We can't have loose ends, Stryver said, pulling a gun of his own, and even in that dress, no one's going to miss you. She allowed herself to roll her eyes now. Maybe not, but my friend over there, she said, pointing to the bar. Every cop in the city is missing him. They all turned. Even Stryver was too dumb to have noticed that the congressman was in the bar with them. Cute, Stryver said, narrowing his eyes, but they're not going to be looking for him in a place like this. Oh, I don't know. You did just use his cell phone. She could already hear the sirens. She had her elbow in the face of the man behind her before he could get a hand on his gun. She turned back to Stryver, smashed his forehead into the table, and took his gun. She punched him in the face and then flipped him over the table, both of them landing on the floor where his chair had been. The guys by the bar dropped as she fired at them, and the gun was out of her hand by the time the SWAT team broke down the door. I actually don't have all that much to say about what we've been reading so far. It's really not bad. But the paragraph that we just had, if you cut a few unnecessary ands or thens, it's really not bad. I think this is one of the better action sequences we've seen so far, which is saying something. Good lord. She began to scream as the swats filled the bar. "It's all right, miss. Just stay down," one of them said to her, clutching her reassuringly on the shoulder. They all ran right past her and towards the back door. Idiots. She got to her feet and smoothed out her dress. Gilly was on the ground, clutching his leg. "Keep some pressure on that, sweetheart," she said down to him. "Call me?" he responded weakly. She didn't give him a second thought as she moved towards the door. She feigned panic again for the benefit of the police when she got outside. "There's a man in there. He's bleeding," she said to one of the officers in a shaking voice. "It's okay, miss. It's okay," she said, helping her down the stairs. She moved past her into the building. She heard her call in the congressman as another officer walked her toward the sidewalk. She was fake stumbling down the street when the police commissioner pulled up and jumped out of a cruiser. She cowered by the wall as he ran by, a bunch of SWATs behind him. The alleyway they went down was ringing with gunshots just before, but had gone oddly quiet. She didn't think anything of it. It was their problem now. She continued on her way and disappeared down another alleyway. Worked like a charm. And that's the end of that chapter. Not bad. Not bad. I enjoyed that marginally more than most of the other chapters we read last episode. I think John's chapter last episode wasn't too bad. Her last chapter, not her first one. But this was good. But let's quickly move on to the next chapter, and you'll see why in a minute. "There's a man in there. He's bleeding." John helped the girl down the stairs. "It's okay, miss. It's okay," she said in a soothing voice. She handed her off to Rose once they reached the bottom and continued up. She would have seen to her herself, but she had to get inside. She found the congressman lying on the floor, clutching a bleeding gunshot wound on his leg. She grabbed her radio. "I've got the congressman. A bullet to the leg, but he's okay." Her head popped up at the sound of gunfire. She pulled her own forearm. Jesus. Easy mistake. I think I and I were like right next to each other on the keyboard. So, she pulled her own firearm and headed toward the back door, looking back to make sure the medics would see to him. The SWATs were engaged in a firefight in the back alley with some thugs. They had taken most of them down, but the remaining few had automatic weapons. She took cover with two of them behind a van. One of the men moved to take aim when a single shot echoed off the walls, sending him to the ground. Damn, she thought, they have a sniper. She was stuck while they were still out there. Another shot echoed through the alley and another until they were overtaken by the sound of sirens. As she rose from her place, she could just hear Gordon's voice shouting commands. There was a smaller alley connected to the one they were in, and she only just saw people disappear down it. John rounded the corner into the alley to find that it was already empty, save for Lieutenant Roberts and a manhole with its cover removed. "Where's the DWP guy?" he asked. "They went down there?" she asked back, and Gordon took SWAT in there after him. Foley came up behind them, sounding disgruntled. He pulled out a flashlight and started towards it. She didn't know whether he would go down or not. The entire alley lit up as a ball of fire erupted from the manhole. It reached up and painted the whole alley orange. They all jumped back from the flames, ducking against the intense heat. Smoke was billowing from the thing when they looked back up. John pushed forward. "We're gonna go down there, right?" "Are you crazy? That was a gas explosion, kid," Roberts said. "Gas? This is a sewer." "No one goes in until we know what's down there." "We know what's down there, sir," John said, exasperated. "The police commissioner." Foley stood up. "Somebody get this hothead out of here, huh?" he said, moving toward the mouth of the alley. "And get me a I keep reading that backwards because, and get me a DWP guy." She backed off. Maybe Foley didn't care what happened to Gordon, but she did. She thought on it for a minute. There must have been something she could do. Then a terrible idea struck her. She shot back to her cruiser. "Where are you going?" Rose asked her when she reached the door. "What's going on down there? You remember the water treatment facility, right?" "Yeah, I do. Why? What the hell happened down there?" "We need to go." Rose must have noticed the look on her face because she hastily got in the car behind her. And that is the end of that chapter. Outside of a few road bumps, again, really not that bad. I will say, I think I did say this last episode, that while John does get the short end of the stick compared to Bruce and Selena, and even another POV character that got cut, who we will talk about in a second, despite that, John's chapters are still usually much more engaging than Gordon's were in Batman Begins. She's kind of like the reverse Gordon, where Gordon had a strong start, and then after that, most of his chapters are pretty weak. John has a pretty weak start, but then her chapters start to get a little bit better. Once we get to the unedited part of the story, though, her chapters go downhill, but we'll talk about that more when we get to that part of the story. These two chapters that we just read are the first of many chapters with overlapping action. What I used to call roshamon chapters, despite the fact that this doesn't actually count as Rashomon's style. But there are multiple moments throughout this story where Selena's chapter will overlap ever so slightly with John's, or where John's will overlap, ever so slightly with Selena's. Bruce doesn't have a ton because, unlike Batman Begins, this book has no third-person Batman chapters at all, which we can talk about later, much later. So their chapters tend to overlap, especially when it comes to Batman-related stuff. But now that we're done that, we do need to talk about the mysterious fourth character. So there is technically a fourth POV character in this story. However, due to the fact that half of this story was rewritten and then half of it wasn't, this character was cut from the rewritten version all the way through, even in the back half of the story where I think his chapters would have been beneficial, but that's just me now. I do have his chapters on a separate document, but putting his chapters back in isn't super easy because his chapters were not edited along with everything else. So, number one, there are certain places where I'm not even sure where his chapters are supposed to go because I rewrote like John and Selena's chapters to fill in the gaps. Furthermore, now because that character's POV is missing, this story is written to sort of play off of the mystery of that POV character not being here anymore, because the cut POV character was Bane's son. He was meant to be our one POV on the villain without giving the actual villain a POV in line with all the other stories. However, I had decided back in the day to cut him out of the story and have Bane be left more mysterious, you know? Like I said, his chapter should have been kept in the second half of the story, because the story is split into like the first third and then the last 2/3, sort of like a reverse Batman, or no, like Batman Begins actually. I refer to it as half sometimes because it does feel like half the story. But his chapters should have stayed in the chapters like following the split. But again, that's me now. But the point is that he was written out of the beginning part so thoroughly that putting his chapters back in really kind of like messes up the mystery that I have going in the beginning part, so I kind of can't put him back in. However, when he very suddenly shows up in the story again without his preceding chapters, his character arc kind of doesn't make any sense. So I'm not gonna put his chapters back in this time around because, like I said, it does mess up the effect of the story. However, once we finish all of the edited stuff, we will talk about him in depth. I might have to do like a special episode or something like that. But the reason I brought him up now is because originally his introductory chapter follows that John chapter and would have been the last of the quote-unquote Rashomon chapters. This despite the fact that it clearly takes place after... Oh, no, it doesn't. It does take place sort of during that John chapter. Sort of. Moving on. So instead of that, we are going to do another John chapter. Look at that. Back-to-back chapters. Why are we here again? Rose asked her as they drove past the many green lawns of the Palisades. Fall didn't seem to touch the place, or at least it hadn't yet. Huge mansions lined one side of the street, and the river bordered them on the other, the murky waters lightened by the clear blue sky reflected in its surface. John couldn't think of a place that looked more opposite from what she felt. I told you, Rosie, she said finally. I just need to talk to him about something. You can't just walk in and talk to Bruce Wayne, you know. We'll see. Wayne Manor looked more like a castle than a mansion. They pulled into the huge circle drive, accentuated by an old fountain that sat in the plot of grass at its center. It felt like the lawn stretched out for miles on either side of it. The heavy wood of the front doors looked much older than they actually were, and it felt like her knocks echoed behind it. An old man, who looked about 60, answered the door. Can I help you? I need to see Mr. Wayne. I'm sorry, but Mr. Wayne doesn't take unscheduled calls, even from police officers. She could feel Rose's eyes on her. If I go get a warrant in the investigation of Harvey Dent's murder, would that still count as unscheduled? He invited them inside. Rose pulled her by the sleeve as he led them down the hall. What the hell was that? She whispered. It was the first thing I could think of. Really? He showed them into the study. Mr. Wayne will be with you in a moment. So, note here that it says that Alfred looked about 60. This is something I actually told you guys to pin during the Dark Knight, and I fucking remembered it. Remember how, like, in Batman Begins, even Bruce remarked on the fact that Alfred, oh, he was old, but he didn't look a day over 60. And then here, John's like, oh, he's about 60. And then in the Dark Knight, Harvey says he looks 70. This was supposed to be like a running gag that Alfred, like, he's aging very well and that he doesn't seem to be much older than he looked like 10 years ago or some such bullshit. I guess it's 10 years ago as of this story, maybe not as of Batman Begins, but I fucked it up in The Dark Knight, and because I never edited it, I never got a chance to change that back. I don't understand how I messed that up though, because it was a very consistent thing, and I don't know why I didn't go back and change it, but just note that it was supposed to be 60 in the other one, and there is a reason for this. There is an actual reason why this is a running gag. It's not just like a haha joke. So let's move on. She had been surprised at how empty the rest of the house seemed, but the study was fully furnished. The shelves were all full, and all the furniture was upholstered with shining gold fabric. Vases of bright pink flowers sat on the tables. Huh, remember those? Heavy black curtains hung from the windows, covered in elaborate gold embroidery. She hadn't seen much, but it was the only room that seemed lived in. Interesting. So, see here. One thing I will say about these stories is that Wayne Manor has a very consistent look, and in particular, the places where Bruce's occupy, or where Bruce's, you know, those two Bruces, where Bruce occupies tend to have a very particular look to it. The color scheme does change a little bit between Batman Begins, which is more like dark red and gold, to black and gold here, but that's on purpose. But I think I did a pretty decent job keeping the decoration of the house intact, because as much as I do sometimes comment on the interior design choices here, they are important in the story, and I did write them the way I did on purpose. Wayne Manor's color scheme versus the color scheme that a lot of other places frequented by rich people in Gotham have is really important for indicating something about the Waynes versus other people. I must have talked about this during Batman Begins, but it's one of the many devices that this story decided to utilize for symbolism. So moving on. They wandered around the room looking at the various artifacts covering the shelves, but not touching anything. Well, good. Go in someone's house and touch everything. John gazed out the window over the back lawns. They seemed to go on forever, like a rolling green void. Johnny. Rose was standing in the middle of the room under the ceiling lamp. Look at that, she said, pointing to the base. 8 little bats were painted around it in a circle. Weird. John grimaced, remembering Mark and his chalk, but she wiped the look off her face and shrugged. He's a weird dude. They both looked towards the door when the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall. Mr. Wayne seemed to have a heavy step. John stepped away from the window when the door opened. He was still in his robe and slippers, but at the same time he seemed strangely manicured. He leaned heavily on his cane. How can I help you, officers? He asked them. John could feel Rose's eyes on her. You know, you really get the feeling that Rose is just along for the ride here, and I kind of love that. This is also notable because in the source material, John is alone. His partner is not with him. So the fact that Rose is here is a change from the source material. Commissioner Gordon's been shot. He looked down, he being Bruce. Well, he's the only he in the scene, isn't he? Never mind. I'm sorry to hear that. He chased a gunman down into the sewers. When I pulled him out, he was babbling about an underground army and a masked man called Bane. It felt weird telling him all that. Rose gave her a look. Shouldn't you be telling this to your superior officers, says Bruce. I did. One of them asked me if he saw any giant alligators down there. She paused for a minute. This would be hard to say. He needs the Batman. Wayne tilted his head to the side. Rose looked at her like she was crazy. Oh God, poor Rose. What does that have to do with me? I don't know how, and I don't really care, but I know you know him. I don't see how. I mean, at that fundraiser you had for Dent, he was there in like 5 minutes. You must have had the guy on speed dial or something. She shrugged. Unless you are him. She entertained the notion herself for a while, but Mr. Wayne seemed too quote-unquote busy to have actually been him. It seemed to work, though. You think a murderer can help Gordon? He didn't kill Johnny Dent. God. He didn't kill Harvey Dent, John said dismissively. He didn't have any reason to. It makes no sense. How so? Honestly, Mr. Wayne, a guy doesn't spend all of his time trying to save his city just to turn around and murder its DA, you know? Wayne looked at Rose momentarily. She shrugged. She does have a point. Either way, he's a wanted criminal. The police will be all over him if he even sets foot on the streets. John shrugged. Never stopped them before. He took a deep breath, but then nodded. I'll see what I can do. Thank you. They showed themselves to the door. What the hell was that? Rose asked her once they got out the door. What? You think maybe we should go see Peter Parker? Ask him if he can get Spider-Man on the case? You know, just to cover all our bases. You agreed with me in there. I was humoring you. Well, I was right. This time. She accepted her victory anyway. They got back in the cruiser. And did you notice they were watching us? Rose said as she started the car. What? Him and his butler. They were in the upstairs window. She shrugged. He's a weird dude. Let me pause there and say, that was actually kind of fun. Wow. It's nice to be enjoying parts of the story now, thank God. This story got off to a rough start. I don't know what about the beginning. I was not feeling it. I think I was so put off by the fact that Bruce's first chapter wasn't what should have been his first chapter that I was just like mad about everything. But anyway. They ran by the hospital later. It was a bit unnerving how the place was always so quiet, even though it was full of people. Gordon was only barely awake when she saw him. They were already on their way out when John stopped. Rosie, she said, grabbing her by the arm. Do you hear that? She paused too. They could only just hear Gordon's hoarse voice through the window. We were in this together, then you were gone. The Batman wasn't needed anymore, a rough, growling voice responded. We won. They looked at each other. Shouldn't we? Rose began, but John shushed her. I want to hear this. They heard Gordon again. Built on a lie. Now there's evil rising from where we tried to build it. Nobody will listen. The Batman has to come back. What if he doesn't exist anymore? He must. They were both speechless. She had always known there was something messed up about how Batman got blamed, but she never would have guessed, never even fathomed, that Gordon had anything to do with it. And what was this about a lie? She didn't even notice that she was shaking. We need to go, she said, pulling Rose toward the doors. And Wayne works fast, Rose said. I'll give him that. And that's the end of that chapter. Wow, that was actually good. Oh my God. I am taken aback. Do you see what I mean, though? About how John's, started off rough, but her chapters get better as we go on up until, the split. Oh my God, that was actually really entertaining. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm just really happy because I was really put off by the first episode and all the stuff that we read up to John's second chapter. Now, mind you, I started recording the podcast a little bit out of order. I'm still a little bit out of order. So I am reading this after reading the story that we will be reading 2 or 3 podcast series from now, which is Profs 2.0. And Profs 2.0, after also having kind of a rocky start, really got good after a while. And then having read that and then coming back to this, which was written a little bit before it, and reading those first few chapters, I was regretting the fact that I had gone forward and everything. So I'm really happy to now come to this stuff and see that it actually isn't as bad as I thought it was. I'm just really happy. Because I'm oh no, I have to slug through this after reading that, and it's just going to be so disappointing, but it's not anymore, and I'm very happy about it. So anyway, let's move on. Now we move back to Selena. She thought she looked good. She'd smoothed her hair into a perfect updo, and it was still warm to the touch as she slipped in a few extra bobby pins. Her lips were painted ruby red, and her black eyeliner winged over smoky silver lids. The pearls around her neck shone milky yellow-green in the incandescent light. She placed the little velvet cat ears on her head. She looked expensive, and that's what she needed. It is funny how this is the second time we've been alerted to the fact that Selena straightened her hair. It was not hitting you over the head with it, but I was really kind of hammering that in as a thing, an aspect of the character. The sound of voices caught her attention. I told you money first. It was Jen, out in the hall. God damn it, you took my wallet, she sighed. She knew that guy would be an asshole. The fucker had 2 wristwatches on him. Wow, wow, wow! Look at that, we got our first F-bomb in a Batman story. Whoa. Get ready, because there are a bunch of these throughout the story. She got up and headed to the door. The idiot was there, fist pulled back to hit her being Jen. He had on bracelets under his other wristwatch, like he needed a wallet. Selena grabbed him. Get out. She took my... He was cut off by his arm being twisted behind his back. Now, she growled as she shoved him toward the stairs. He went. I don't know what he was so upset about, Jen said with a shrug. She straightened her leopard print shirt. He only had $60 in there. It was probably the watch. Watch? Selena let the Rolex fall from her hands and into Jen's. God, you're good. Remind me to teach you how to fight, Selena said as she moved back into the apartment and began to slip on her shoes. She leaned to put on her other shoe, but then she snatched herself back. Whoa, watch it, sister. Her cat, Sylvie, had tried to rub against her. She couldn't go to this event with cat hair on her, even if it was black. She stepped out of the house onto a street that was bright as day, even though it was night. King Street was the only place that far down with lights that bright, except Old Town, maybe. As she moved toward the street, she noticed a Lamborghini sitting across the street. What the fuck? A beautiful thing black that was... A beautiful thing black that was too nice to whatever. A beautiful black thing? A beautiful black thing that was far too nice to belong to anyone who lived in that part of town. This line confuses me because Selena lives in the red light district of Gotham City. But the implication, I guess, is that are there pimps that have Lamborghini? Like, why would anyone in this part of the town own a Lamborghini, period? Let alone a nice one. Like, what? Are there not nice Lamborghinis? I'm confusioned. It was probably some rich idiot looking for some quote-unquote company. She was glad she never had to do that. Gotham had a penchant for producing spoiled assholes who couldn't not cheat on their wives. She put it out of her mind and hailed a cab. Yeah, that's definitely someone looking for quote-unquote company. Definitely not a Lamborghini that we've seen before. The party was held at the Natural History Museum, situated in the best part of Uptown. She'd never been there before. She never had the time or the interest, but they really did the place up. The event itself was held in the front hall, under a domed ceiling painted to depict the vast expanses of space. They'd thrown silver around the place wherever they could, and it wrapped around white marble and hung from the ceiling in streamers. That should have been 2 sentences, joined by a semicolon, but whatever. She let herself drift through the crowd, trying to find the richest-looking people she could. Everyone pulled out their best for the night. It seemed like they just couldn't wait to show off their riches, these people. She thought it funny. She looked just as good as any of the other women there, and her dress probably cost a fraction of theirs. Eventually, she found herself upstairs wandering through the cases of the gem gallery. Beautiful stones and pieces glittered back at her from the glass. There were so many different things. Emeralds set in platinum and encircled in diamonds, a small boulder whose insides sparkled with amethyst, and even things that seemed pointless, like polished balls of aquamarine. She wondered if she could ever pull off a heist from a place like this. These pieces would pull a lot of money. Then again, some of these were so nice she might just keep them for herself. I wanted to note that the gem gallery here is based very heavily off of the mineral gallery at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum down in Washington, D.C. If any of that was familiar, like the polished balls of aquamarine. The one in D.C., the polished ball is made of topaz, but still. Can you do that with, you know what, let's not get into that. See, this is the kind of shit that gets me into the weeds because I used to be a geology student. So I'm like, wait, can you do that with beryl? And it's like, we don't need to talk about that. A glimmer of green caught her eye. There was a beautiful necklace in a case near the exit to the balcony, 3 green pearls set in silver, surrounded by tiny round diamonds in white and yellow. The little plaque said that it took the original owner 10 years to collect the pearls, because he wanted the genuine olive green color that only saltwater pearls could produce. Jesus, she thought, how did Wayne's dad get his hand on an entire strand of those things? It must have taken them ages to put it together. It probably cost more money than she'd ever had in her life. But of course, she thought, she shouldn't expect any less from the richest man in the world. She was still admiring them when a familiar voice drifted through the entryway. Even when you were a recluse, you didn't come to these things. It was that woman, Miss Tate. She was more interested in who she was talking to. A recluse? It couldn't be. True, she heard him say. It was Wayne. Proceeds go to the big fat spread, not the cause. It's not about charity. It's about feeding the ego of whichever society hag laid it on. She groaned internally. He had the nerve to sound smug, like he hadn't been throwing the same exact parties before he stopped showing his face. Ugh. Actually, this is my party, Mr. Wayne, Miss Tate told him. Oh, and the proceeds will go where they should because I paid for the big fat spread myself. That's very generous of you. It took everything she had to keep from laughing out loud. Served him right. You have to invest if you want to restore balance to the world. Take our clean energy project. Sometimes the investment doesn't pay off. Sorry. You have a practice apathy, Mr. Wayne. A man who doesn't care about the world doesn't spend half his fortune on a plan to save it, and isn't so wounded when it fails that he goes into hiding. There was a moment of silence. Have a good evening. Selena had started to turn herself when she heard Miss Tate speak again. "Oh, and Mr. Wayne, I prefer rich bitch." She had nothing to do with it, but she felt as if she'd won her own victory. She turned and headed back the way she came so she wouldn't run into him. So this is a common thing in Selena's chapters, especially where she will be in a place and overhear certain things. It comes up in multiple chapters because, as we saw in John's chapter, she and Rose just happened to overhear the conversation between Batman and Gordon. Selena purposefully stays around so she can listen to the conversation between Daggett. Her first chapter is just her completely eavesdropping on everybody, literally. And then here we have this. With her in particular, I think it's more like showing a character instinct because she is not a spy, but kind of. But it makes sense that she would be the kind of person who would stand around and eavesdrop on everyone to get information and stuff like that. But the thing about it is that sometimes they overhear scenes that aren't necessarily important to stuff happening to them, even if they are important to the story in general. But moving on. After searching for an hour, she finally found someone who met her criteria. A guy with hair whiter than his face, whose wife was away from home and left her jewels behind. She could do with some diamonds, she thought. She talked him up while she danced with him in the middle of the crowd, letting him know just exactly what might happen before his wife came back. "Mind if I cut in?" someone said behind her. She grimaced. The man started to protest, but Wayne shoved his cane into his hands and took her by the waist. Sorry. She danced for his benefit. Pin that line because it's going to come up multiple times throughout this. "You know," she started through gritted teeth, "you might have an easier time walking if you ditched the stilettos." He shrugged. "Yours are taller. Not so happy to see me. You were supposed to be a shut-in. Felt like some fresh air. Why didn't you call the police?" she asked. She was genuinely curious, especially after what she'd seen upstairs. "I have a powerful friend who deals with these kinds of things." His eyes flicked up toward the ears on her head. "Brazen costume for a cat burglar." "Oh, yeah? And who are you pretending to be?" she said. The gown he was wearing wasn't really anything special. "Bruce Wayne, eccentric billionaire." She raised an eyebrow. "Who's your date?" he said, jerking his head toward the other guy. "His wife's in Ibiza, but she left her diamonds behind. He's worried they might get stolen." "It's pronounced Ibiza," he said. "Wouldn't want these people realizing you're a crook and not a social climber." She narrowed her eyes. "You think I care what anyone in this room thinks about me?" "I doubt you care what anyone in any room thinks about you." "Don't condescend, Mr. Wayne," she said through her teeth. "You don't know a thing about me." "Well, Selena Kyle," he started, "I know you came here from your walk up on King Street, modest place for a master jewel thief, which means you're either saving up for retirement or you're in deep with the wrong people. You don't get to judge me just because you were born in the master bedroom of Wayne Manor. Actually, I was born in the Regency room." God, he's such an asshole sometimes. God, oh man. "I started off doing what I had to. Once you've done what you've had to, they never let you do what you want to." "Start fresh." "Oh, honestly," she said, "there's no fresh start in today's world. Any kid with a cell phone can find out what you've done. You can disappear off the face of the earth and start new right now, and I'd still pull up articles about you burning your house down 6 years ago. We're the sum of our mistakes. Or our achievements. The mistakes stick better," she told him. "Trust me." "You think that justifies stealing?" "I take what I need from those who have more than enough," she said, motioning towards the others in the crowd. "I never stand on the shoulders of people with less." "Robin Hood?" "I've done more to help someone than most of the people in this room. More than you." "Maybe you're assuming too much." "Do you think this all can last?" she said, leaning into his ear. "There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. You and your friends better batten down the hatches, because when it hits, you're all going to wonder how you ever thought you could live so large and leave so little for the rest of us." "You sound like you're looking forward to it," he said, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged lightly. "I'm adaptable." He considered this for a moment. "Those pearls do look better on you than they did in my safe." He reached up and unclasped them, and they slid from around her neck and into his hand, "but not nearly as good as they looked on my mother." She glared at him, gritting her teeth behind pursed lips, then grabbed him by the neck and kissed him. She slid his valet ticket from his pocket before she separated from him. She saw him wipe his mouth as she moved away. He was such a goddamn prick. I mean, God. Anyway, let me go because we're almost at the end. For a moment, she had thought that she might have been wrong about him, but that was before she found out he had apparently been stalking her. He wasn't any different than the other rich assholes in this town. Disgusting scum, she thought. They're always disgusting scum. At the door, she put on a sweet act and handed the valet boys the card. "I didn't know there was a Mrs. Wayne," one of them said nervously. She smiled. "A lot happens in 4 years." She watched them pull the car up front, the same Lamborghini from across the street. She couldn't even have begun to act surprised at this point. She strode right up to the driver's side. "What about Mr. Wayne?" the boy said. "Oh," she said nonchalantly, "he'll be taking a cab home." And that's the end of that chapter. That chapter was good. Quality check. It was fine. I am totally okay with it. I actually really liked it. This chapter really makes me realize that Christopher Nolan's dialogue, for as much as I dislike some of its quirks, it works. It is very, it's not snappy, but the back and forth works very well. We are going to have to talk about Selena's character arc, but I can't do it now because we're not far enough into the story. But this chapter is important for establishing Selena's attitudes toward people with more money than her, and that's important going forward for all the wrong reasons. But we will have to talk about it later. But just pin this entire chapter and all of her thoughts about Bruce especially, but about rich people in general, because they do become important down the line. So that said, Selena's interactions with Bruce, I do love that when she kisses him and then he wipes his mouth and she's like, "Oh, he's such a prick." And it's like, you can't just randomly kiss someone and then get mad because they didn't want to get kissed. That was kind of funny. But I actually don't have all that much to say about this. I will say that I did mention already, the eavesdropping in Selena's chapters, that her eavesdropping tends not to be actually character important. Compare it to John's eavesdropping, where that is directly related to the thing that happened in the first part of the chapter, you know? Here, Selena mostly just overhears conversations that we wouldn't have heard otherwise because the chapter's not from someone else's POV, you know? But yeah, outside of that stuff, this chapter was fine. I liked it. Also, you know what, actually, I think pin the fact that Selena thinks that Bruce is stalking her now, because this is really important in her beliefs about Bruce. But it's also very notable because I do like that the story kind of shows that the stuff that Bruce does as Batman is really unsettling when he's not Batman. Because when Batman says, "Oh, I know this about you," it's scary, but it's okay, he's Batman, that's why. But when Bruce Wayne does it, it's what the fuck, you know? But anyway, moving on. We are moving to a Bruce chapter now. He walked in the offices painted yellow by the morning sun and covered in gleaming glass. It was just the way it had been before, and he didn't know why he'd been expecting any change. Then again, in the span of 4 years, this city could turn into anything. These passages about how things can change. It's so shocking how Gotham City changes in 4 years. It's not like that always happens everywhere all the time. This isn't the fucking suburbs. Calm down. Again, you can tell that I did not spend all that much time in a city before I wrote this story. He lingered outside of the door to Lucius's office under the pretense of examining the comet orchid on the side table. It wasn't as big as the one he'd seen when they first met. Ooh, that's symbolic. "Mr. Fox," he heard Miranda say, "I believe in what Mr. Wayne was trying to do. I'm only asking for explanations because I think I can help." "I'll pass along your request," Fox said, "next time I see him." There was a momentary pause. "He doesn't talk to you either?" "Let's just say that Bruce Wayne has his eccentricities." A chair slid across the floor. "Mr. Fox, are you aware that John Daggett is trying to acquire shares in Wayne Enterprises?" "I was not, but it wouldn't do him any good anyway. Mr. Wayne retains a clear majority." "And what's this about the Wayne Foundation not funding orphanages in the city anymore?" "We just don't have the money for that at the moment." That was news to him. He let himself enter the office now. He passed Miranda as she left and nodded towards her politely. Her blue eyes sparkled as she smiled back. It actually put him on edge. "Bruce Wayne, as I live and breathe," Fox said. He looked happy to see him. "What brings you out of cryo-sleep, Mr. Wayne?" "Oh, he's back and he's better than ever. I see you haven't lost your sense of humor, even if you have lost most of my money, apparently." Fox looked at him. "You always have been a good listener, but in reality, you did that yourself," he said with a shrug. "If you funnel your entire R&D budget for 3 years into a fusion project that you then mothball, your company is unlikely to thrive." "What are my options?" Bruce asked as he lowered himself into the chair. So let's pause real quick. The reason why Miranda asks about the orphanages is because originally John asked about that in the equivalent of the chapter where she goes to Wayne Manor. In the movie, he asked about it, but because that got cut because John's content in that scene was completely changed. So I had to pick up the thread here instead for the sake of the audience, I guess. But it does kind of make sense that Miranda would be worried about that given her character. So, moving on. "What are my options?" Bruce asked as he lowered himself into the chair. "Well, if you're not willing to turn on your machine, I can't. I'm sorry. Then sit tight. Your majority keeps Daggett at arm's length while we figure out a future for the energy project with Miranda Tate. She supported your project all the way. She's smart and quite lovely. Oh, not you too, Bruce said, exasperated. Fox seemed to back off then. At least show her the machine. I'll think it over. Bruce got to his feet. Nothing else? He stopped. No. Why? These conversations used to end with some unusual requests. He felt a pang in his chest. I retired, Lucius. Let me show you some stuff anyway. Fox smiled. For old time's sake. Bruce couldn't say no. So, to talk about this briefly, because this will become more important later, the way that Bruce is very just like, about getting together with Miranda, and even like Alfred, he kind of said it as a joke about him getting with Selena, but Bruce very clearly does not like her like that. And there is a reason for this. As you go through the story, you have to really consider this in the context of that second flashback chapter from Batman Begins, because if you look at it out of context, it really just comes across that Bruce just doesn't like women. And I don't mean that in like a misogyny way, I mean that in like a gay way. Because, like, literally every time someone is like, oh, this lady, she's kind of nice, Bruce is like, no. But he dated Tony for, like, a solid, like, 2 years? But then you have to consider the fact that they very nearly ended up getting married, and Bruce backed out because he seemingly is afraid of commitment. His situation is slightly more complicated than that, but yeah, I've noticed this nowadays. I feel like this is not something I ever really was aware of before now, because due to my own, like, I don't want to say issues, but issues with identity and labels over the years. Like, of course, when I first wrote this read exactly the way that it meant to, and I was like, it comes across completely like he is this. But now that it's been years since I've written this and I've moved on in my life, and I have a completely different, like, sexuality label than I did 6 years ago, now I read it and I'm like, huh, interesting. Seems gay, guys. But it's not. Also, again, there's the Rachel thing. But as the story goes on, we will talk about Rachel. We will talk about Rachel. But even that kind of like falls into it. So we'll talk about this more in depth, like much later in the reread. But pin this stuff. Pin it all and like connect it with your red thread, and then turn around like that picture of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's like connecting the dots. Because it's all connected and it's all important. He led him through the familiar space, all gray concrete and white light. Tumblers were scattered over the floor, half covered in white sheets and tarps. Steel cabinets and heavy plastic containers lined the walls and stood by covered tables. Tumblers as in the vehicles like the Batmobile, not tumblers like the shit you put liquid in. Can you imagine if they walked in and it was just covered in whiskey tumblers? It's like, what the hell are you even doing down here? I figured you would have shut this place down, Bruce said. It was always shut down, officially. But with all this new stuff? Bruce moved and lifted the tarp over one of the tumblers slightly. It was built just like his had been, but the barrels of the cannons were a bit bigger. He was reminded of how much he missed his and how much he hated the desert camouflage. After your father died, Wayne Enterprises set up 14 different defense subsidiaries. I've spent years shuttering them and consolidating all the prototypes under one roof. Mine. Ooh, why? To stop it from falling into the wrong hands. Besides, I thought someone might get some use out of them. Bruce just shook his head. Fox took him towards a garage door that began to rise as soon as they approached. So let me pause there just momentarily to say, the fact that the tumbler is just mysteriously gone is another reason why I should have written The Dark Knight all the way through. Because there is no indication that the tumbler was at all destroyed in The Dark Knight, I know it happened in the movie, and I know the audience could reasonably deduce that it also happened here, but just show it. I don't understand why I didn't write it all the way through. It could have been a good story. Like, the fact that the events aren't different doesn't change the fact that the character of Bruce specifically is different. And seemingly Harvey has some different stuff going on, and he would have been a POV, so I don't understand why I didn't just fucking write it. Anyway, now you're just showing off, Bruce said with a smile. He thought the vehicle that sat behind it was absolutely beautiful. It was obviously designed with the same aesthetic as the tumbler, but made for the air instead of the ground. Its sleek plates were painted a very dark shade of gray. Bruce fought hard to keep the emotion he was feeling inside off his face. Defense Department project for tight geometry urban pacification, Fox began. Road is configured for maneuvering between buildings without recirculation. Oh, what's it called? It has a long and uninteresting Wayne Enterprises designation, so I took to calling it the Bat. And yes, Mr. Wayne, it does come in black. Bruce moved forward and ran a hand across the side. It was perfect. Are you sure I can't tempt you with something? Pneumatic crampons, infrared contact lenses. At least let me get you something for that leg. I told you, Lucius, I retired. He could tell Lucius heard the lack of conviction in his voice. He knew he would end up leaving there with something. God, and that's the end of that chapter. I hate that line. I hate it, and you will see why much later in the story. But the chapter wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. It definitely has some interesting content in it, even if the actual like events itself aren't all that interesting. But it is important. It is very important. You have to consider it in the context of the story. And because we're reading through it gradually, it's hard to. Man, the chapters that we read this episode were a lot better than the ones we read last episode. I'm happy. I'm really happy with this. I am glad that this story is starting to pick up. I will say that despite all of the little like things that do harken back to the fact that this was written very early on in my writing career, quote unquote, career. I don't have any money. Despite all those little things, those things that I didn't edit out despite coming back to this a whole year later, this stuff reads pretty well. And it definitely isn't like bad. I am glad that I rewrote a lot of this stuff. But that's where we are going to end it here, though. I do feel like I should have read the last chapter we read with the next chapter, but at the same time, we can just, it works. It's fine. So next episode, we will begin with another Bruce chapter. Again, double chapters. So I will see you for that. If you like this video, like it on the YouTubes, and then subscribe, and also watch other videos. If this is the first one you're watching, because you're not subscribed, maybe go back and watch the Batman Begins ones, or listen to them rather, because those will be useful for understanding this. Anyway, I will see you next episode. Bye!